They walked to the guillotine singing, not screaming. While all of France watched in silence, 16 nuns chose faith over fear, peace over panic, and courage over survival. One by one, their voices rose louder as death came closer, until the final note was cut by the blade. Who were these women, and why did their final song terrify a revolution built on fear? This is the haunting true story of the 16 nuns who sang on their way to the guillotine. In the darkest days of the French Revolution, when fear ruled the streets and suspicion could send anyone to prison, 16 Carmelite nuns from the small town of Compiègne became symbols of extraordinary courage. France was drowning in violence during what became known as the Reign of Terror, a period when thousands were executed by guillotine under the revolutionary government. Religion, especially the Catholic Church, was seen as an enemy of the new republic. Churches were closed, priests were arrested, and religious communities were forced to disband. The Carmelite nuns of Compiègne were ordered to abandon their convent, remove their habits, and return to ordinary life. But these women, devoted entirely to prayer, silence, and service to God, refused to let fear destroy their faith. Though they obeyed the order to leave the convent building, they secretly continued living as a religious community, meeting in private homes and maintaining their vows. Their peaceful resistance made them targets. Authorities accused them of being enemies of the revolution, fanatics who secretly wished for the downfall of the republic. In truth, they were women of prayer, not politics. Yet in a time when paranoia was stronger than truth, innocence offered no protection. They were arrested in June 1794 and taken to Paris to face trial. The charges against them were vague but deadly: religious fanaticism and loyalty to forbidden beliefs. The outcome was already decided before they entered the courtroom. Still, witnesses later described their calmness as almost supernatural. While others begged for mercy, the nuns remained peaceful. They believed their suffering had purpose. Some even felt they had been preparing for this moment for years. Their prioress had once spoken of the possibility of martyrdom, and now it stood before them like an open door. These 16 women, ranging from young novices to elderly sisters, did not face death with despair. Instead, they prepared to meet it with prayer, dignity, and song, an act that would leave one of the most unforgettable scenes in the history of the French Revolution. The Carmelite nuns of Compiègne were not rebels, spies, or political conspirators. They were women who had chosen a life of silence, discipline, and devotion. Their days were built around prayer, simplicity, and sacrifice. They rose early, attended prayer services, worked quietly, and lived with almost nothing. In a world driven by ambition and survival, they had stepped away from power and comfort to dedicate themselves completely to God. Yet during the French Revolution, even this peaceful life became dangerous. The revolutionary leaders believed that religious orders represented loyalty to the old monarchy and to traditions they wanted destroyed. Monasteries and convents were seen as symbols of oppression rather than places of faith. In 1790, a law was passed that dissolved all religious communities in France. Monks and nuns were ordered to leave their institutions and return to civilian life. Many obeyed out of fear or necessity, but the Carmelites of Compiègne struggled deeply with the command. Their vows were not temporary promises, they were sacred commitments. To abandon them felt like betraying their souls. Even after being forced from their convent, they stayed connected in secret. They met quietly in small groups across the town, continuing their prayers and supporting one another. They wore ordinary clothes to avoid suspicion, but their spiritual identity remained unchanged. This hidden faith became dangerous. Neighbors watched neighbors. Informants were everywhere. A single accusation could lead to arrest. The nuns were eventually reported for continuing religious practices and for supposedly supporting enemies of the revolution. Officials searched their homes and found letters, devotional items, and signs of continued community life. To the Revolutionary Tribunal, this was enough proof. They were labeled enemies of the state. But what shocked many later was not the accusation itself, it was the response of the nuns. There was no panic, no betrayal among them, no desperate attempt to save themselves by blaming others. Instead, they accepted their arrest with remarkable calm. Some wrote farewell letters filled not with anger, but peace. They believed that if their deaths could help bring peace to France, then their sacrifice had meaning. In a nation consumed by bloodshed, these women chose serenity, and that choice would soon make their final journey unforgettable. After their arrest in June 1794, the 16 Carmelite nuns were taken from Compiègne to Paris, the heart of the revolution and the center of the Reign of Terror. Paris was a city drowning in fear. Every day, carts rolled through the streets carrying prisoners to the guillotine, and every day crowds gathered to watch executions as if they were public entertainment. The prisons were overcrowded with nobles, priests, ordinary citizens, and anyone accused of being against the Republic. Once inside these prison walls, hope was rare. Most people understood that a trial before the revolutionary tribunal was often just a formality before death. The nuns were imprisoned in the conciergerie, a grim and infamous prison known as the final stop before execution. Many who entered never came out alive. Yet even there, the Carmelites created an atmosphere unlike any other. Fellow prisoners later spoke of their peace, their kindness, and the strange calm they carried into a place filled with terror. They prayed together softly, encouraged the frightened, and showed no bitterness toward their captors. Some prisoners were amazed that these women, facing almost certain death, seemed more concerned with comforting others than saving themselves. The youngest among them, Sister Constance, was especially remembered for her innocence and gentle courage. She had once spoken of a dream in which the entire community would die together for God, and now that dream seemed terrifyingly real. Their trial came quickly. The charges were simple: they were accused of fanaticism, of keeping religious objects, and of maintaining loyalty to their vows rather than to the Republic. In the language of the revolution, faith itself had become a crime. The tribunal offered them little chance to defend themselves. Questions were sharp, judgment was already decided, and the sentence was inevitable: death by guillotine. For many prisoners, such a sentence brought collapse and despair. But the nuns responded differently. Witnesses said they accepted the verdict almost as if they had expected it all along. They asked only for time to prepare spiritually. No screaming, no resistance, no pleading for life. Instead, they turned inward, toward prayer. Outside the prison walls, Paris continued its brutal rhythm. But inside, 16 women prepared not simply to die, but to transform their execution into an act of faith the world would never forget. On the evening of July 17, 1794, the 16 Carmelite nuns were led from the prison and placed onto open carts that would carry them through the streets of Paris to the Place de la Nation, where the guillotine stood waiting. It was a journey many had taken before them, usually filled with tears, screams, or silence born from terror. But this procession was different. As the carts moved slowly through the crowded streets, the nuns began to sing. Their voices rose together in the ancient hymns of the church, calm and clear above the noise of the city. They sang the Salve Regina, a prayer to the Virgin Mary, and the Veni Creator Spiritus, a hymn asking for the presence of the Holy Spirit. People who had gathered expecting another ordinary execution were stunned into silence. Even those who hated religion could not ignore the strange power of the moment. These women were not walking toward death like victims, they seemed to be walking toward something holy. Witnesses later described how the usual shouting of the crowd faded as the singing continued. The streets that often echoed with insults and cheers became quiet. It was as if the city itself paused to listen. The youngest nun, Sister Constance, sang beside the oldest, and all distinctions of age disappeared in that final act of unity. Their courage was not loud in the way revolutions are loud. It was steady, disciplined, and deeply unsettling to those who believed fear could control everything. Revolutionary officials watched closely, perhaps irritated that these women refused to show the panic expected of the condemned. But there was nothing they could do to stop the song. The nuns had already won something greater than survival: they had kept their souls untouched by terror. As the cart approached the guillotine, the blade stood against the evening sky like a symbol of the revolution itself, cold, efficient, and merciless. Yet the sound of prayer challenged that symbol. Here were 16 women with no weapons, no political power, and no army, facing the most feared machine in France with only faith and harmony. Their final procession became more than an execution, it became a confrontation between violence and peace, between force and conviction. And as the crowd watched, it was not the blade that seemed most powerful, but their voices rising toward heaven. When the carts finally reached the Place de la Nation, the reality of death stood directly before them. The guillotine, stained by months of executions, towered over the square as both a weapon and a warning. Thousands had already died beneath its blade during the Reign of Terror, and for most people, simply seeing it was enough to break the strongest spirit. But the 16 Carmelite nuns stepped down with a peace that